Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. Rachel Zegler's newest movie opened Friday as of the time that I'm recording this video. And that movie is none other than, wait for it, The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which is the 9th longest movie title in the history of cinema, as I had talked about in my previous video that I had released on October 22nd. Yes, that's right, at 52 characters in length, it's not a particularly memorable title, but it's essentially what the author of the Hunger Games book series, Suzanne Collins, named her 4th book, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. And guess what? As I had also talked about in my previous video, as of April 2023, only 3.5 million copies of the 4th book have sold in North America since it was released in 2020. And that only represents no more than around 5.1% of all the Hunger Games books sold, because as of 2014, over 65 million copies of the original trilogy of books have been sold. In other words, not that many people bothered to read the 4th book, and that doesn't bode well for this movie. And it's been 8 years since the previous Hunger Games movie was released in 2015, but this is not a sequel. As the 5th Hunger Games movie, because Lionsgate divided the 3rd book into 2 movies, this is not a continuation of 2015's The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2. That's because Collins' 4th Hunger Games novel is considered to be a spin-off and a prequel due to it taking place 64 years before the events that are described in her first Hunger Games book. But guess what, folks? Prequels have a history of not doing as well as their original movie counterparts. And here are some well-known examples. 1979's Butch and Sundance: The Early Days, which was nowhere near as good as the original 1969 movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. George Lucas's Star Wars prequel trilogy that began in 1999 and ended in 2005, and was not as popular or well-received as his original trilogy. Peter Jackson's The Hobbit movie trilogy that began in 2012 and ended in 2014 was also not as well-regarded as his Lord of the Rings trilogy that he directed in 2001 through 2003. And finally, there were J.K. Rowling's Fantastic Beasts movies that ran from 2016 to 2022 that were essentially prequels to the very popular Harry Potter movies, which were based on her 7 extremely popular books. In fact, Rowling had been intending for there to be 5 Fantastic Beasts movies. But last year's movie, Fantastic Beasts: The Secrets of Dumbledore, which I had talked about in several videos that I had released at the time, was not only the worst of the 3 Fantastic Beasts movies, it was the first Harry Potter-based movie to flop in theaters, which effectively ended that series at 3 movies. And that 3rd movie was very disappointing. So with the very poor sales of Collins' 4th book, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, as compared with her original trilogy, and the fact that it's a prequel and a spin-off, as well as the fact that Rachel Zegler is starring in it, I was in no way surprised that the initial predictions for this movie's domestic opening weekend box office were rather low when I released my October 22nd video. But unlike the ever-falling predicted domestic opening weekend box office numbers that Disney's newest MCU movie The Marvels was getting, which turned out to be true, the latest predicted domestic opening weekend box office numbers for The Hunger Games: The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes have gone up slightly since my other video. So instead of a possible range of $35 million to $45 million for its domestic opening weekend box office, Box Office Pro is now predicting a range of $42 million to $55 million. But will that actually make much of a difference to this movie's bottom line in terms of its ability to break even? If we compare that predicted range to the domestic opening weekend box office revenues that this movie's 4 predecessors earned between 2012 and 2015, it doesn't actually look that good, because the lowest of those 4 predecessors, Mockingjay Part 2, earned $102.7 million for its domestic opening weekend box office. And that's nearly double the highest number for this movie's predicted range. But what isn't surprising, as illustrated in this chart, is that the Hunger Games franchise movies have experienced diminishing returns since the release of the second movie, which earned $158.1 million for its domestic opening weekend box office. The subsequent 2 dropped, and this 5th movie is only continuing that downward trend. So what does this mean for this 5th movie's possible final domestic box office? To get an idea as to how much that might be, we'll first look at the history of the original movie's average weekly drops as illustrated in this next chart. Interestingly, there's very little variance between their 4 values, which average out to 36.8%. The standard deviation between the 4 movies' average weekly drops is only around 0.6%. So given how incredibly small that standard deviation is, I decided that it was far too small to accurately project how this 5th movie may do, given that it's both a spin-off and a prequel, which we all know means that it will probably perform much worse than the original movies. Further, as this next chart shows, the final domestic box office for the 4 original movies mimicked the domestic opening weekend box office numbers by continually dropping after the second movie. So I decided to multiply that 0.6 standard deviation by 8 to create a broader range of possible outcomes for this 5th movie. So 4.8% above and below the franchise's average weekly drop of 36.8% is a range from 32.04% to 41.56%, which I think is more reasonable. And when I use that range to project the possible final domestic box office for the movie, starting from the predicted range's midpoint of around $48.5 million, as the movie's possible domestic opening weekend box office, I get the following range of numbers. $116.7 million at the low end, $131.8 million at the mid-range, and $151.2 million at the upper range, which is an overall higher range of values than the ones I projected on October 22nd. But the mid-range value of $131.8 million for the updated projected final domestic box office values is still less than half of what 2015's Mockingjay Part 2 earned domestically with its $281.7 million. And that's not actually a great sign for this movie because statistically, that's the most likely outcome. Now we can project where this 5th movie's possible final global gross box office might end up at by using the franchise's overall domestic share of 49.21% and creating a range of possible values that are 1 standard deviation above and below the average. And with an overall franchise standard deviation of 7.74%, that creates a range from 41.47% to 56.95%. And the resulting range of possible projected final global gross box office values goes from a low of around $204.9 million to a high of around $364.7 million, with a mid-range of around $267.7 million. This is also a higher range than what I had projected on October 22nd, but will it be enough for this movie to break even? To gain some perspective, the final global gross box office for the previous 4 movies ranges from a low of $646.5 million to a high of $864.9 million. And if we compare the final projected final global gross box office range to the lowest of those values, which was 2015's Mockingjay Part 2, that projected range is 43.6% to 68.3% below that, which will be a massive decline in revenue for the Hunger Games franchise. Now, when I did my previous video about this movie back on October 22nd, I had mentioned how I had not found any reports regarding this movie's production budget. But now there are reports, and it's a lot lower than I was anticipating. It's reportedly only $100 million, which, if correct, would make this 5th Hunger Games movie the second cheapest to produce of all of them. And given that I have not seen all that much in the way of advertising for the movie, I'm only going to estimate a single break-even point rather than a range because it's probably closer to only being 2.5 times the production budget. And that's to account for the 50% of gross ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget. And when I do that, I get an estimated break-even point of approximately $250 million, which means that there is around a 50% chance for The Hunger Games: The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes to break even, because my current mid-range projection is $267.7 million. So if Lionsgate did indeed keep their production costs down to $100 million, then this movie actually has a decent chance of breaking even, unlike Disney's MCU movie The Marvels, which most definitely will not. So, The Hunger Games: The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes could become the first movie starring Rachel Zegler that doesn't flop. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.